All
Hey
right.
everybody. Was a intro I wanted to sort of show. This stream is all about talking about iPads and iOS setups with hardware. So that example you just heard at the beginning is my guitar going through my pedal board, going into a mixer, which then hits the iPad and then the interface. Um, and it goes through a couple different apps. I'm using AUM as sort of my hub host for all things audio and MIDI. And then I've got a sort of a noise reduction just to eliminate any sort of hum that may be coming out. And then it goes into Borderlands Granular, which is doing the granular processing and pitch shifting. And then finally, there's a Alteza Reverb, really, really nice algorithmic reverb on iOS. So that's sort of a primer. I'm going to try to talk about the setup, how I sort of came to this workflow using the iPad with my hardware. And we have Christopher here to ask questions and talk about whatever he wants to talk about. I believe we're not going to talk about Zoya Zebu stuff today.
Yeah, I couldn't get the camera and everything set up. I'm not good at this stuff, but I
Totally
am here
fine.
for eye candy. Is how you really should describe me. I'm wearing my sexy Henley shirt, so
Nice choice.
uh, I thought I'd up the sort of eye candy factor that we're already known for, but just bring it up to the next level.
Definitely. So yeah, I'll try to keep it mixed between sort of showing off examples. I have a couple ones sort of prepared, and then talking about like the setup and general stuff about how do you connect certain things, what are some useful apps that I've purchased or bought for free or no longer use, that kind of stuff, to try to go through some helpful tips. Um, and then we'll take a pause, just talk about whatever, and then we'll get back into the second half. Um, so the setup. Why did I decide to get an iPad for music? Well, I had I still experiment with DAW stuff, and most of the time I usually treat it as sort of like the last place where the tunes end up and get edited and mastered and stuff. I don't really create within the DAW. I have effects, I have plugins and stuff like that, but for the most part, that's where like recordings live and they get mastered and sent out to the world. It's sort of like the final stage. So I wanted something that felt a little closer to like the creation aspects. And I didn't want more hardware. I already have too much hardware. So the question was, how can I bring in something that was a sort of combination of really good software with a good interface that was tactile and provided me, a lot of good software options. So we decided to get an iPad a couple of years ago. I got an iPad Pro. It is the 2021. It's before they introduced the M1 chip. So still using the older chips, but it's still plenty powerful for what I'm using it for. I haven't noticed any, sort of shortages on DSP or any craziness like that. It'll last me a decent amount of time before I upgrade to the M1 or M2 or whatever.
Yeah, maybe that's a question that I could ask. Um, it seems to me like a lot of the power of iPads is like directed at people who are doing like video processing, which is way more intense than not. I mean, audio processing can be intense, but
Right.
you know, it's a little bit of apples and oranges if apples are gigantic and oranges are not very big. Um, so like I think one of the questions someone might ask is like, how powerful do you think I need to go with an iPad if I'm thinking of going down this route?
Sure. That's a very good question. I see it can go a number of ways. Some people, and a good resource. I'll sort of start with that. A really good resource for iPad or iOS focused music discussion, a bit of gas, that always comes with any sort of discussion, is the Audio Bus forum. Audio Bus is a forum and a development by, I think it's one person. It's the same person who makes Loopy Pro. He made Audio Bus, the app for iOS, which is it's still viable, but with AUM, it's not as big as it used to be. But it was like the first big mixer for iOS, like audio and MIDI mixer.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, it's a great forum, and there's plenty of discussion about what to buy, what apps, and that kind of stuff. But I've sort of seen it go two ways. It's one, buy the highest spec device that you can afford, is the advice that I usually see, and I agree with. Whatever you can reasonably afford and whatever specs you can get the highest one that you can, because it's only going to last as long as it's properly spec'd for. Mm-hmm. So if you buy an old iPad, an iPad 2 or whatever, it's going to be a very old chip. It's still going to run stuff, but there may be, depreciations in the apps, depreciations in the software, and the firmware that's running. I also see people using multiple iPads in a setup, and sometimes they will opt to get one that has a headphone jack because they really want that interface, and that's only available, I want to say 2018 and old or something like that. I did not. I really wanted the USB-C, for instance, so I went with the iPad Pro 2020 version. Like I said, I think I could check the specs. I think it's either 128 or 256 gigs. Let me check. 256. So I got the 256 gigs iPad. I figure it'll last me a good amount of time. 5 years would probably be about right. Maybe a little longer if I, treat it really well, which I think I do. But yeah, I would go with either of those approaches. If you think you're going to use multiple, maybe opt for an older one that has the older connectivity, or if you want it to last a while, get the highest spec ones you can afford.
Okay, that's yes. Sounds good. It sort of looked like you were waiting for me to ask a follow-up question. I have none. Yeah. We've obviously practiced this a lot. You guys know we're very professional.
We know what we're doing.
Yeah.
Sorry, I have to answer a text real quick.
Well, then I'll fill space and time with something. Our professionalism is unmatched in the industry of roughshod live stream shows that air like every 3 months or so.
3 months is probably putting it a little.
I think over the course of the time that we've been doing this, it's probably about every 4 months.
Yeah,
but
that's about right.
Yeah. So, are you good?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay.
So we'll talk about, I guess, maybe initial woes, because
Okay.
I think now that I have the setup sort of more or less figured out, it did take some amount of time, as any sort of like software hardware mix would.
Yeah.
Gonna have a similar thing with the Octatrack once I figure that thing out, but that's sitting behind me for a long time while I work on it by itself. So initially, when I got it, I was doing basically standalone stuff. I was playing around with Sampler, which is a very old app, but it's one of the best apps you can get on iOS. It's sort of like it looks like a OP1, but it's not exactly the OP1 workflow, but it has a similar sort of aesthetic.
Yeah.
But it's a sampler that you can sample into and place effects and do like granular stuff and weird sort of like processing, and it's all really, the touchscreen is implemented very, very well. So like stuff like that, I was just messing around with just it by itself.
Yeah, that's where I am at. With I've bought some apps, I fuck around with them, but I feel like it's a lot of just sort of, well, that's neat, there's a next level, obviously, and that's part of why we're here. But I
right.
For the viewer at home, that's where I'm at.
Yeah, and I was there for a decent amount of time, and I still think that's probably its greatest strength. To be honest, it's something that is more portable than any other hardware will ever be. It's more powerful than any other hardware will ever be. Like, people bring their OP1s, and that's great, and it's a very viable platform for what's the word I'm looking for? Portable
Creation.
music making.
Yeah.
Like people bring those everywhere, but like you can do that and so much more with an iPad. So that I think that's still its greatest strength, and I really love seeing when apps are implemented well with really good multi-touch support and AUV3 and stuff that just makes it like more flexible with how you want to use it.
Yeah.
Bringing it into hardware is where you get into sort of like, okay, how do I connect this thing? What do I need? What dongles do I need? What cables do I need? And it becomes sort of like a little bit of a headache. And that's how I sort of felt initially.
Hmm.
And I'm sure a lot of people would feel the same way. It's like, this thing doesn't have a headphone jack. Like, how am I supposed to hook it up to my interface or my mixer? And I went through a number of different, I'll call them solutions with quotes. The first one was sort of dedicating a 2x2 audio MIDI interface to the iPad using a USB dongle. And I can grab it just to show you. It's just one I grabbed on Amazon. It's an Anchor dongle. It's got 7 or 8 inputs. It's got 2 USBs, a USB-C, power, SD card, HDMI. Exactly. It's a very good dongle. I recommend it. It helped me out initially, especially getting samples in because you got the SD card.
Right.
Very easy. And that worked for a decent amount of time. So I plugged into the USB-C jack on the iPad into that thing, and then a USB cable went into my interface, and then the interface in and outs worked with my mixer. So basically what I was doing is I was because at the time I only had the 2x2 interface.
Right.
Exactly. I lost the ability to record into my DAW because I only had one interface at the time. So I was basically using that interface to get the iPad into like as a synthesizer.
Right.
Which was fine because I was just sort of jamming, and the things that I could record, I recorded to the iPad.
Yeah.
So things that internally were on the synth, things that I was making in Drambo or Sampler or whatever. And then I figured out that the mixer that I had this alt out. So I can send audio into an external place without it interrupting the main outputs. So this way I can get audio from the guitar, another synth, whatever, into the iPad, and then I can record into that. So that became my DAW for a decent amount of time. So that went on for a while, and then I kept thinking, okay, do I want a bigger mixer? Do I want a bigger interface? How do I sort of handle this stuff? And I guess I'll back up for 1 second because people are probably curious, like, okay, how did you actually play it? How did you play a synth into the iPad? Like, it has keys, but you have to press the touchscreen, which is a really good touchscreen. And that's where a USB MIDI interface came in. So I can plug in a DIN cable from, a MIDI keyboard or the Hydra or whatever, straight into the interface. If you aren't using one that has MIDI, you can use a Roland UM1, which is a very popular, very, very stable USB MIDI interface cable. It's like $40. I use it in my setup still. It's how I get MIDI into my Zebu. So I have the UM1 hooked up into a USB hub, and then the in and out ports are in Zebu, so it can connect back and forth that way.
Yeah.
So it's a very, very common thing, and it's a great way to interface with synths or getting. Maybe you have something like I did at the time. I was messing around with polyphonic aftertouch because I was like, ooh, I have this Hydra synth. I have this really cool thing that I can use. But can I send poly aftertouch to it from the iPad. So I was like figuring out how to do that. 'Cause there's a couple of the Moog synths on iOS have.
I just wanted to talk about another option, which is like Bluetooth MIDI. This sends Bluetooth. I have a Korg Nano Key Studio that I would have pulled out because it's a little bit more like affordable and obvious, because it's just a little like, it's not very big, but it's a nice portable keyboard that like is about the size of an iPad.
Yeah.
So Bluetooth is another option for the MIDI side of things, at least if for one-way MIDI going
One-way MIDI,
in,
right.
you know.
And from what I hear, those have pretty good latency. Like it's pretty.
Yeah, you know, I mean, there's some, but it's, you know, it's nice for like doodling around, you know. If I just want to like chill out and play a synth, you know, it works for that just fine. Bluetooth is always going to have some latency for some technical reason that I can't explain, but angst, I can never figure out how to pronounce it. Angst, I want to say angst, can probably explain. He knows the tech specs better than I do. So anyhow, just
right. It is another option. Yeah, there are Bluetooth MIDI keyboards. There's a number of ways you connect. You can use the little WIDI jacks, the CM.
I have some of those somewhere. Well.
So there's a lot of options out there. I just sort of like figuring out, like, you know, what do you want to do with it? Because it's a platform that has so much flexibility that you naturally sort of like, okay, I could do X, Y, Z. How can I actually get that all connected and working smoothly? So that process took some time. And I was saying before, because I was using the smaller interface just for the iPad, just to get that audio in, that I finally realized, okay, I need to get a different interface. I need something that allows me to have some sort of USB MIDI hub was one of my goals, because I had a number of peripherals connected to this dongle.
Right.
You know, I had keyboards, I had MIDI controllers, I have a fader, not a fader fox, a Flighter Twister for MIDI knobs and all that kind of stuff. So like, what's a convenient way for me to plug those in? But also, can I simultaneously get audio from the iPad and my DAW at the same time? That's when I arrived on, from what I understand, and I might be wrong about this, but I think it's the only interface, and again, I might be wrong, there might be others, don't come at me, the only interface that offers dual device connections. So basically you can get audio to and from both devices at the same time, as well as MIDI connections between them. It's the iConnectivity Audio 4C.
Okay.
There are the software is pretty crap to use. I won't lie about that. It took me a decent amount of time to figure out the routings, but I did figure it out. And basically it's giving me the flexibility that I wanted, where I can get audio in and out of the iPad, in and out of Logic, for instance, what I'm using, and all interface with my mixer and my DAW. And I can record everything at the same time, rather than having to like specifically pick what I'm recording on the iPad, because that was sort of the only destination that I had.
And I at this point, I'd just like to say, manufacturers, you know, this is not a small, you know, this is not a passing fad, right? You know, so that sort of integration between computer and iPad, or, you know, just all sorts of, you know.
Or even two iPads.
Right, yeah.
Right.
You know, get on that, people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like, to be fair, like, I don't use as much of the audio passing through the two devices as much as I thought. Excuse me. Because I was talking about this in Gear Chat the other day. We were talking about like Patch Bay and like Matrix mixers, and like that's a great idea. Like I love that idea. It's just too many ideas.
Right.
So you know, it's great that you can pass audio MIDI through them, and I pass MIDI through both of the devices using the hub, which is great, and that works very seamlessly. But for audio side, it's strictly just like I treat them as sort of like their own separate instruments. They have one set of ins, one set of outs each. There could be more than that, but I choose not to interact with that side of things. So yeah, that's sort of like how the setup looks. I can take more questions about like specifics. I can make some other recommendations for dongles or some other ideas for like how to connect things. But basically for me, it was basically find an interface that allows me to connect a bunch of USB MIDI devices and get that audio in and out.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I ended up. Yeah. Do you have any other comments or questions about that?
So, you know, I mean, I guess the one thing I'd sort of ask, you said you don't like use it in that, but do you send audio into your iPad and then into your DAW with some regularity or no?
Which controller? So I'll answer Christopher's question first. So the way that the setup works is the interface has 2 sets of ins and 3 sets of outs, physical connections. So one of those inputs is using that aux alt channel on my mixer, where I can send, well, like I was doing before. So I pressed the alt channel and it sent my guitar through the iPad and then came back through the mixer.
Okay.
And then the main outputs goes to 3.4, which is hooked up to the DAW.
Okay.
So that's sort of how it works. Like everything hits the mixer and then it hits the DAW at the end. The iPad comes in as its own sort of separate channel.
Right.
I can set it up the other way where it goes through the DAW and then ends up in the iPad.
Right. Okay.
So that's where I sort of like selectively pick which like plugins I want to use. So like if I really want to use like the Arteria effects, I'll loop through the DAW and then record on the iPad.
Got it.
If I want to use like FIC or Borderlands, I'll loop through the iPad and then record on the DAW.
Okay. Yeah, that
so
makes
it gives
sense.
me that flexibility for choosing like which way I want to record and what effects or what synths I want to play, and then where it ends up being recorded to.
Okay.
Which controller do I have with my iPad? So I will use this opportunity to switch cameras for a little bit. So I can sort of show off the
production value.
Hi. I'm gonna
minimize me
dim
maybe
that so you don't see. Hi. I need to see it a little bit.
Do you want to make me? There's the thing where I get really small, maybe because we're looking at stuff now. We don't need to look at me as much as I'm eye candy. Yeah. Yep.
I've done this before.
There.
There it is. Okay. Cool. All right. So this is the setup. Hi. Yeah. So I'm using my Hydrosynth 49 as my main controller for basically everything. So it's its own controller. It sends DIN MIDI to actually, yeah. I'm not actually sending DIN MIDI at all, am I? I think it's just USB MIDI. It going to a bunch of different places. So USB MIDI is hitting the iPad. It's hitting the Roland UM1, which ends up in the Zebu. It's also connected to the DAW through the same way that it's connected to the iPad. And then I've got the MIDI Fighter Twister, which is, again, hooked up to the MIDI hub so it can hit.
Your mic's a little loud, or you're a little close to it. I can't tell, Mike. So it's clipping a touch.
Oh, sorry. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I was getting too close to it, I think. So the MIDI Fighter Twister could control a bunch of things. I have some layouts where it works with Analog Lab or different apps on the iPad. I also have a template for the Zebu patches, and some MIDI control for some of my pedals, which are down below. So it's all sort of like interconnected through the USB hub. So it's not one controller, just a bunch of controllers all sort of stacked together. Where it sort of gets interesting is, and I don't know if you can see this, but yeah, you can't see it. So I'm just going to switch cameras back. The lighting's terrible. My apologies. Hi. To sort of like determine those routings. So I have some routings that are like normaled, to use a modular term. So the interface software allows me to set up MIDI routings and audio routings and save them. So basically this means that I can use the interface without it being plugged into anything. I can just use it without the iPad or without my computer open, and it saves those routings, it saves all the MIDI information, and I'm set to go. So I have like things like the Fighter Twister is always hooked up to the UM1, or the Hydrosynth is always hooked up to the UM1, or whatever. There's certain routings that are always there, and then anything else addition to that, I set up using AUM's MIDI matrix.
Okay.
So AUM is probably, it should be included with iPads, in my opinion. It's an audio mixer and MIDI matrix app. It's probably the best app you can get if you're into music production. It offers a more modular sort of approach. And I mean that, I don't mean that by like patch points. I mean, literally like you set up channels, you set up different insert effects, you set up different send effects, you set up the MIDI routing. So it's modular in that sense, rather than sort of like a timeline based DAW. And there are a number of them on iOS. There's Cubase, there's GarageBand, there's Beatmaker, there's a ton out there. So there's no shortage of options in terms of like music production apps. So AUM would be my recommendation for what I personally use, and I bought that pretty early on, and I haven't really strayed from using it. So I would wholeheartedly recommend it. So it offers a very flexible MIDI routing, so I can set up additional routing. So let's say, for instance, if I'm using one of the generative sequencers on iOS, such as Rozeta or Zwa, I think it's called, I can hook that up to the Hydrosynth or to my modular or the Zebu, and then have that control those things rather than me playing the keys. So it allows for like additional routings on top of the normaled ones. And that was a long-winded answer to say what controller I use. It's basically everything is a controller.
Everything's a controller and everything is controlled.
Exactly.
Just real quickly, how are you getting CV to the modular? You mentioned you using it just as a quick extension of that discussion.
Sure. So a while back, so right now what I'm using for modular is any sort of MIDI data or information that gets sent to Zebu first, and then I'll use that as a MIDI to CV controller, which works fine for my purposes. I found that in general, MIDI to CV is best treated simply. So like stuff that you'd normally see, like pitch, gate, mod wheel, after that sort of like simple connections. Like I'm not usually going to send a MIDI LFO from the iPad into the Zebu to get an extra LFO, because I could just make that in Zebu.
Right.
Like I don't need that extra. Like what I do need is I need a way to press a key and then have that end up being, a volt for octave signal for something else.
Yeah, I think like the one place where I could see a little bit more of that is less like an LFO and more like a modulation lane. Like if I'm recording, if I've like written a sequence and I want to record some, like a slow sweep of the filter as it comes in, like I that's like kind of Bitwig bread and butter, which is what I use primarily.
Yep.
Um, so
So
yeah.
in terms of that, I would say for apps, there's a couple that I know of, and I use these more when I had the ES9. So for a little bit, I had an ES9 in my rack, which was my if this was filmed a lot earlier, that would have been the interface that I used for the iPad because I
Mhm.
was using the iPad as an extension of the Eurorack. So, but that had a more direct connection because it was DC coupled and it had more sort of options. But I found it became um, a little overwhelming.
Yeah.
But the options that I have used and like using, there's an app called oh geez, um, oh come on, Covariant. There's an app called Covariant, which um, they specifically made it with the ES9, ES8 in mind, but it'll work with any DC coupled interface where you can send pitch gate, modulation lanes, that kind of stuff.
Right.
And then there's also this app made by, I think he's a Moog dev, Grant Bevins, something like that. I forget his last name. But he made an app. It's a free app. It's called MIDI Tape Recorder. And what it does is you can record MIDI on up to 4 channels, and it's non-quantized.
Yeah, I remember this.
It's just totally whatever MIDI you put into it is going to be recorded, and then you could send that out however
Yeah.
you want. So I use that sometimes for recording, unquantized, melodies or sending off aftertouch information or whatever. And then the big one is Drambo, which could be entirely. I
Yeah.
can spend like hours talking about Drambo, so I
Yeah.
won't start there.
I didn't mean for us to go all, I just sort of,
No.
you
It's
know,
a good question.
yeah.
Yeah, but if I had the ES9, I would be using it more. But I just use the Zebu for stuff like that.
Yeah. I'm sort of the mindset of let modular be modular,
Yeah.
but not everyone is.
No,
So
I totally agree. That's a good point. Cool. Um, yes, it is overwhelming.
yeah.
It's very well built, but you need to have a sort of a purpose in mind to use it.
And you need to spend some time understanding the paradigm that it was designed under.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. All right, cool. So I wanted to run through. I had planned for a couple sort of like breaks where I did music. So I wanted to run through another example. So before, if you were around for the beginning, I did a live guitar granular plus reverb using some iPad apps. So I want to do something similar, but with a sort of more pedalboard focused thing. So this is Tonestack Pro is the app that I'm using here. Um, okay, so Tonestack Pro is the app that I'm using here. It's sort of they offer a number of different amp and cab emulations, which I mean they sound fine. I'm not really that big about amps and stuff or even IRs, but they sound fine for my purposes. There are plenty of apps that offer. Nembrini is a good one that has like some options for like different heads and cabs and stuff. But this was just basically like here's a bunch of options plus some like really cool effects. So there's like a space echo, there's a pog, there's a DMM, there's a bunch of different like effects. So what I tried to do is I tried to mimic my pedal board, like my physical pedal board in this app. And what it ended up doing is I ended up hooking up my Morningstar MIDI controller, foot controller, through the MIDI connections to the interface. That way I can switch off effects to the app when I want. Basically, that's what I'm going to run through for a little bit.
There we go.
Okay. So I'm using that alt channel to get audio into the iPad, and then it's being sent to the DAW so you can hear it. So that's just me plugging in with one drive pedal to the iPad. I'm not an expert on this, but I literally hear no latency. Like, I don't hear any. Like, I'm playing and I hear it. So it's very responsive. I know some people that might be a real concern. Like, oh no, I'm plugging into this DAC and back and looping it. So like there must be like 30 milliseconds of latency, but I literally hear none. And for comparison's sake, this is what it sounds like without the iPad. All right, so now we'll start with the effects. So I call this one pedalboard plus amp because it has a couple amps that, I don't know, they sound fine to me. But it's got a bunch of effects. So like my board it's got a couple drives, it's got delays, it's got reverbs, it's got a reverse delay. So I tried to mimic that. So I'm just going to kind of run through each effect as I go through. Cool.
Yeah, that sounded good. I did notice a little bit of latency. There was like a sub-octave thing.
Yep.
Was that the POG? Like, and that makes sense.
There's a blue box pedal. Yeah, that's probably where it was coming in.
But that, I mean, that's pitch shifting. That's just the name of the game with pitch shifting.
Yeah, the POG is pretty good. I only use the upper octave on it, though. That's just how I prefer to use it. But yeah, that blue box thing definitely adds a little bit. But overall, like it's pretty responsive.
Yeah.
Yeah. just in case people are curious, I was using two cabs. I was mixing cabs. I was using the Modern Gain 4x12 and the Albert 4x12, whatever they're supposed to be modeled on, I don't know. And then there's also a compressor in there just to clean it up a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. It's basically how I use my pedal board. I mean, obviously there's more functions, there's more looping stuff that I do on my pedal board, but for, most intents and purposes, it does fine.
Yeah.
Cool.
So let me ask a theoretical question.
Sure.
Like, is there a point where you see like all of your music production might, like if this is reproducing a lot of the ways you use your pedal board, right? Like then there is that question, right? Like, do I need a pedal board?
Right.
So like how do you sort of balance that if you do? I don't, I mean, I'm just sort of you've got a better answer than I have a question version of this, I think, probably.
No, it's a very good question. I'm sure people are curious because, I see this more and more. People there's like, and we saw this week. The Strymon announced the Big Sky plugins, and Moog just announced the Moger Foger plugins. Like, do you necessarily need hardware? And I'm going to specifically, and I know this is a big reason for most people, I'm going to specifically ignore the tactile aspect.
Sure.
Specifically, like, I don't care about knobs. I don't care about buttons. I just want something that sounds the same.
Right.
Or very close. And I think the only thing that I can really think of is you get used to maybe, I don't want to say abusing, but hardware isn't like perfect. Like there are ways that you can abuse hardware
Sure.
that can't really be mimicked in a way that you would use a piece of software. So
Right.
for instance, in that app, like I'm not going to spend too much time like tweaking specific presets for that fuzz. I'm going to pick one sound that fuzz makes. I'm going to turn it on and off.
Yeah.
I'm not going to worry about stacking too much. I'm not going to worry about like using an expression pedal to like ramp a filter or something. Like I'm going to use it like in one setting and turn it on and off.
Yeah.
Is basically how I'm going to use it. And it's going to, for most of the time, be good enough.
Yeah.
But in those cases where it's not, that's where you need something that has that extra either combination of things. Maybe it works better with fuzz before or after the delay or whatever. Like there's some like reason that you would want to keep around that piece of hardware, even if it makes no financial sense and it makes no sonic sense or whatever.
Right. So let me ask two questions as a follow-up. One is that we talked about a period of time where I talked for a while and one of the things we talked about was the plugins. So should I do that now?
Sure.
I don't know if that was a cue or not, is basically my question. Like, were you saying, hey, we're at that point now? But maybe before we get to that point, the other follow-up question, which chronologically makes more sense to ask first. So putting that aside, let's say you're some 14-year-old kid who wants to get into music making. Like, you don't have a pedal board already. You don't have, you've got a guitar and an interface.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is there a sort of a future where you see kids just saying, that's it? Like, I've got an interface, I've got a guitar, I've got an iPad, and like that's the way that I build like my sound, because it does seem like, particularly if you come in at it the other way around, like we're talking about, I've already got a bunch of crap, I want an iPad and then some other accessories to make the iPad work with everything, and I've got to think about my interface and dongles and right, like it's an investment, but it's a different sort of investment, I think, if you're like someone just getting into the game, right?
I totally agree, and I'm inclined to say yes, but I know that the powers that be, the gear machine sort of pushes that out from the reality.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't think you can reasonably expect, especially for kids, I'm trying not to generalize, but just thinking about me as a 13-year-old.
Kids are dumb. We understand it.
Kids
You
are
can
like me as a 13-year-old, the one thing that I wanted was an overpriced guitar, specifically a Gibson, that I ended up getting.
Was
And
it
I
a
loved
Gibson
it.
SG? Because
No,
I
Les
wanted a
Paul.
Gibson SG when I was 13. That was
It was
my
Les Paul.
okay.
The Les Paul I still have is the white
Yeah.
with gold hardware.
Yeah.
I love that thing.
Yeah.
And like at that age, you probably don't you care about like aesthetics. You care about like fitting in. There's a bunch of other like variables you can conflate with that. But ideally, yeah, I could see a future where like people just getting into the game would like pick up like a MIDI controller and like the free version of Ableton Live, or an iPad and like just a very simple MIDI controller.
In theory, that's the Billie Eilish story, or at least the way that the media sort of like took it, right? You know, is like there's some other things going on with that story involving like, you know, like it's not just some random teenage girl who like wrote a platinum album in her bedroom with her brother, you know, like her brother was, you know, like there's a bunch of stuff there, but like that is a myth that could inspire other people. You know, the other way, the thing I was thinking about is you were answering that is that like, okay, maybe we don't have it now, but like sooner or later, we're going to have a iPad Guitar Hero. And I don't mean the game. I mean like, you know, like an iconic guitarist who says, this is what I use. This is, you know, because I think like part of it, right? Like you were talking about when you're 13, like that, the aesthetic, but like part of that is like some artist, you know, used that guitar and you saw it and you said, I want to be like that person.
Frank Iero, My Chemical Romance.
Okay. See, I don't know those references as well as you do. But you know, for the SG that I wanted as a kid, I listened to a bunch of punk records, and like the SG was one of those guitars that you just saw splashed across like, a bunch of snotty looking kids from Bristol, you know, like, and one guy's got an SG slung over his hip. And so like, that's why it was, you know, a thing for me. And so I think that may be, and I think there will eventually be some artists, you know, like you already see some artists. I was just listening like, and it's not even that new. I was just listening to an old Jim O'Rourke record that I hadn't put on for a while. And like, I was listening to it. I was like, how the fuck does he do all this stuff? And then I remembered like Jim O'Rourke was messing around with Mac's MSP stuff, or some precursor to it. I don't know. Like in the early, like late 90s, early aughts, like a bunch of his stuff is like these programs that he wrote that do all these like weird, you know, like guitar shuffling and so, you know, like I think like there's already like a group of that for the like desktop world.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Like, and so like I think it's only a matter of time before we have like some really iconic guitarist who says like, I'm just gonna tour with my iPad. That's all I like.
That's all I need. Right.
I've got a MIDI controller to like get me to the different presets, but like beyond that, like I'm just plugging into my iPad. I can do a bunch of stuff on it that I can't do with my pedal board, you know, like the, you know, the Granular apps. There's some really like intricate, you know, I'm terrible at names, but I've got like this, crap. I'm never going to remember the
Spacecraft?
name. I don't remember. I've got like this weird delay that I got from, I don't know, some company. My iPad's over there. But it's a really sophisticated delay that does all sorts of stuff that like I can maybe I've got my modular over here. That's still not in frame. I've got my modular over here, like, and I've got a bunch of delays in it, and they all do wacky, weird shit. And if I put all of them to work at once with a bunch of modulation, I could do the thing that this one app does when I press this preset, you know?
Right.
So like, there's like, it's not just that there's a ton of power and a ton of portability, but there's also a ton of innovation in the world of iOS, right? Like, if I had to pick one area where it seems like there's the most innovation in the music world right now, I'd probably pick the iOS ecosystem, because there's like every week or so there's like an app that comes out, and like, yeah, some of them are kind of riffs on things we've seen before, but like people are putting in new wrinkles, and like, oh yeah, like I've seen a granular delay before, but this one has like a really neat mod matrix, you know, and this
Right.
one, and so um, you know, I just sort of think we're at this moment, you know, and the other part of it, and I'll transition into the plugin thing. I'm talking a lot here. I know that
Thank
I'm
you.
doing the thing we talked about,
Thank
where
you.
but you know, with the, you know, like, I think we talked about the you know, like the Big Sky comes out. Uh, did I remember that? Big Sky? That's
Big
the name
Sky.
of the, yeah. And the Mogerfoger line, and there's probably another one that I'm
The Mini
forgetting.
Freak has a VST too.
The Mini Freak has a VST2. Wampler put out a pedal a couple months ago, like simultaneously with a VST as well.
I think it was a reverb or delay. Delay.
I think it was a delay, but I'm not positive. I'm showing some of my like snobbery because I don't follow Wampler that closely, but I probably should. Brian's a really nice guy. And like the books he wrote on modding pedals probably started like a bunch of careers of people that I pay closer attention to. But you know, like the like we can sort of discuss like, okay, you know, I think my initial reaction to Big Sky was it's kind of pricey. My reaction to Mogerfoger was not so much that it was pricey as that I didn't expect it to be as pricey, because their iOS apps are very reasonably priced.
Yeah.
And like the fact that I have to buy all of the effects is like a good and a bad thing. Like I had a Freak box at one time, and it's a weird pedal, but I'm not going to buy an app to get that back. Like,
No.
the things I'm there for are like the cluster flux and the delay, and you know, that sort of thing. So like the pricing there, like it wasn't so much the total, it was that like I had to buy everything at once, you know, whereas if like it was a $20 low pass filter app, I'd be like, great, awesome.
Also, another component of that is their other apps. So like their synths are all
iOS, right?
but they're like you can buy it on the iPad and use it on your Mac.
Yeah, right.
And
I didn't. You can't do that with. Well, they're not
they
iOS.
said not iOS compatible.
Right.
So it's by far more expensive than anything else. Like you can buy Model D for like $15.
Yeah, and they give it away for free every now and then because
Right, exactly.
just,
and you can use it on your computer.
Yeah.
Same time. Yeah.
So like, but I think what we're seeing here, even though they're not going to come out and say it, is like looking for revenue streams in a period of, you know, chip shortage, and like, you know, and like that's not like I haven't seen Strymon like going out of stock anywhere. I think they're doing okay in terms of like fulfilling their orders. But there's another component of the chip shortage that like gets overlooked, which is that like you need chips to innovate with, right? Like, and so like I wonder, I don't wonder that much. I know like part of this is that they're looking for different ways to bring in revenue in a period where they can't innovate because they don't have the means to do it. You know, like I know Strymon just put out, you know, their phaser and the Star Lab. So like, it's not like they're not putting out new stuff, but you know, those might have been in development before any of this sort of came down the line in terms of, the catastrophe of the
2020.
2020 and 2021 and 2022. And
Also, the R&D like timeline on something like a plugin is way shorter than any hardware.
right. Yeah. I mean, that's, and it does take a specialized skill set that like your company may or may not have, and I don't know whether I'm sure they probably hired someone to
I would
help
assume so.
develop this stuff. But like, the other, so, like some people go, well, why doesn't everyone just make a VST? Well, it's hard. And like the other part of it, the really hard part of it is like, you don't know when Apple's going to be like, here's a brand new update that fucks your entire, like, I'll tell you, as big as the iOS community is in music, the music community in iOS is not very big.
Very tiny.
So they're not real concerned when like they break all the, the drivers and whatnot with a new update. So, like but it is interesting to see this trend. And the other part of it that's like, you look at a company like Eventide, I'll say, like who's been doing this sort of hardware software, like they have some things that have physical, tangible, like analogies, but they also have stuff that couldn't have physical analogies because of like the ways in which it leverages that opportunity to like redesign interaction. So a lot of their like sort of higher end tone shaping, like the transient stuff that they do is really cool.
And split EQ and stuff like that.
Yeah.
That's something you couldn't really see in a I mean, you would need a giant console.
Right. Yeah. Like that's, like you can visually represent things in ways that you couldn't, and you can have like a bunch of options that, like, if you did it in hardware, it would either be like bunch of menu diving or
$10 million.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Like knob for function is great until you have a lot of knobs, and then like it still might be great, but like I actually like it's something that discourages me. I'm gesturing off screen to my Arturia Polybrute. Like sometimes I just sit down at that thing and I'm like, it's too much shit. Like I've got to twist too many things to like get the sound that I want. I kind of want, like, there's an alternate world where like the best form factor that was ever developed was the one that Waldorf did with like the Blofeld and the Pulse 2, where they've got this nice little row of knobs and like you press buttons, and like it's really, I used to have a Pulse 2, super fast to like edit on that. You don't have as many knobs. You don't, like you can't touch everything all at once, but like anyhow, I'm just riffing at this point. I didn't know how long you made it go on, but like
I think that's great. I'll just comment one thing about the plugin stuff. You mentioned that, like, I think a lot of people sort of are expecting it nowadays. I mean, when you have big names like Strymon and Moog now, I think it's going to be some maybe more of an expectation going forward. And and like you're saying, since they don't have the opportunity to get new chips and develop new stuff, they're going to want to find new ways to make money. That's maybe a little heavy on cost up front. Like they got to hire somebody, they got to figure it out. But I think we'll see that more and more, especially. And I know Joel said they wouldn't be doing this, but I have a feeling that CBA like would be a big name to get into that.
Right. Well, yeah, and I assume we're going to see that Max for Live generation loss thing ported to more platforms.
Yeah. For sure.
because Joel basically said, if people want this, and like everyone who read that was like, yeah, people want that. Like,
Right.
of course they do.
I don't want it in Macs. I want it in everywhere.
Yeah. So like, and that's an interesting place where like you're also seeing a lot more controller software and that sort of thing, right? Like, and some of that's third party. It's really sort of interesting to see that dynamic.
It's actually interesting because I remember I got I don't know if we were talking about this, but when I had the initial idea about the Zoya librarian app, there was, I forget their name, but I did reach out to them a while back because they published some code. They made some Maris and CBA MIDI editors using, they hosted it on GitHub, and they used Python. So I reached out because I was curious. I was like, oh, this looks cool. Like, can I have some tips? I'm thinking about making an app. So like that stuff does exist, and you could, reasonably do it.
Yeah. Something I thought of, and then it disappeared from my mind.
While you do that, I will prep the next.
Well, one thing I did think of that's not particularly important is I just thought of another name that's deep in this hardware software hybrid thing and has been doing it for a reasonable amount of time now, which is noise engineering. And you see like they're sort of all over the place in terms of like like they're working with the Daisy ecosystem for a lot of their stuff now, which opens up some opportunities for alternative firmware and SKD development and all that sort of stuff. And then they're doing plugins, and then they're designing oscillators for the Arturia Matrix Brood and Mini Micro and for things that Arturia makes, some of which were announced this week.
Yes.
But yeah, so I think that's like an interesting place to watch, and like along with this idea to just bring it all the way back that I started with, which is iOS seems like this place where there's like a lot of people doing interesting stuff. And they were doing that before it was like maybe a necessity thing.
Right.
Like years ago, iOS was still like, I remember people like recommending, what's the first really big, was Borderlands the first really big
sampler Borderlands
granular thing?
Yeah, Borderlands just hit its 10-year anniversary.
Yeah.
Which is wild to think about.
Yeah. So like I remember like hearing about it, maybe not 10 years ago because I wasn't that cool, but like 7 years ago, people were like, hey, I think I was like reading about the Particle 1, the Red Panda Particle 1, and people were like, use iOS. There's this thing that does even more crazy stuff, and like, okay.
Yeah. And on the like app side of things, one of the first synths that was on there was one of Yonac's. He made the Magellan 1, which is like 10 years old or 12 years old or something crazy like that. So I think, and I still think this is true, but it's becoming, maybe it's moving a little away from this, but I think for the most part, you see that innovation, especially in iOS, is because it's usually one person or a very small team making these things. Like it's not giant companies. I mean, there are some, there's like Arturia has some iOS stuff, Moog has some iOS stuff, and they're all great. Like there's totally nothing wrong with them. But like you're seeing these, people, just regular people that know how to code really well and want to make something cool, and they do it.
Yeah, no, I think it's a lot like the indie game world, right? Where like there's not a lot of overhead, right? To get into it. So, well, there's a lot of like intellectual overhead to get into it, but like, the hardware side is like, it's something that if you like know the code and you like want to do it, you can do it.
Right. It's fairly straightforward. So I think that's why you're seeing that. Like, it's always been sort of like sole proprietors will go where like the innovation is, and that's sort of how that plants itself. So I did the previous couple of music breaks were about getting external audio in. So I used my guitar for both examples. I could do that with really anything. I do with Hydrosynth audio or the Eurorack audio, but just a little easier with the guitar. Now I'm going to focus on getting audio out of the iPad and then process using external gear. So just flipping that and seeing how that works. So I'm going to play around with one of my favorite synths on the platform. It's made by Sugarbytes. It's called Factory. And I have it hooked up to, again, everything's a controller. So I'm using the MIDI Fighter Twister for some physical knobs for changing the sound of the synth. And then I'm going to be using the Echo System and Reverb, Empress Reverb, for a send effect.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just going to get my notes to remember what settings I used on the reverb. All right. Just checking my levels real quick.
Say a touch high, but it's better.
All right. I tried to, there was a little bit of a period where it was getting a little high, but I tried to tame it in time.
While you were playing, I looked up Factory, which tastes the power of liquid modular, which is a weird phrase, but modular synthesizer for complex and organic sounds. Choose from the most particular synthesis methods. Let yourself be charmed by the matrix. There's a mod matrix that's displayed in the and morph between the most improbable variations of your sound. 4 sequencers are pulling the strings. Behind the curtain, Factory is polyphonic supersonics.
I think Sugarbytes is German.
Yeah, there's definitely a little bit where I'm like, English is not your first language, but it's not bad.
Yeah, so that was a So the nice thing about Factory is it's got two oscillators, which are it's sort of the same idea as as like a Pigments or the Mini Freak, where you have variable kinds of oscillators. You
Hmm.
have like wavetable, you have granular, you have sample based, you have virtual analog, that kind of stuff. Um, and then it's got like a crossfader where you can. It's not as like in depth as like the Octatrack, where you can set different scenes. It's like you have
Right.
an A and a B,
Yeah.
and you can sweep between them, and that can change anything. You can change the effects. You can change the mod matrix or whatever. So that's like a guitar ish kind of preset that I had came up with, and added some delays, and then I added the extra delays and a spring reverb from the Empress effects.
Hmm.
So it's very easy to get audio in and out at the iPad is what I was trying to show off with that segment, as well as my slightly improved keyboarding skills.
They're good. They're coming along.
Thank
I
you.
I like it.
Thank you. Thank you. Um, yeah, I originally had like I will do more, but I was gonna like do more within each section, but I didn't want to spend too much time. I wanted to maybe talk about things more than playing, but I can offer more examples of external processing. But you kind of get the idea. Like you can play a synth from the iPad and then mess around with it with the iPad effects and the hardware if you
Yeah.
want.
One thing. Let me. So one thing that I, like also point out is that looking up something very poorly while I try to talk and fill space. Uh, One thing that that can't be right. Uh, Factory is free as an iOS app.
So
Like I read what I read was from the Factory plugin, the VST page, which is not free.
right, they
Um,
have VSTs and they have iOS apps.
mhm,
So I think it's like 3 of their iOS apps are free, meaning you
mhm.
can download them and play a fully functional working demo.
Yeah,
However, they do limit you in there's no AUV3, there's no saving presets. It's just
right.
like here's the synth, play it standalone, see if you like it. If you want to buy it, great.
What is the thing I was getting at was like the VST is $140. What is the iOS app when you unlock
So
the full
uh,
version?
the IAP, the in-app purchase for Factory, I think the regular price is $20.
That's what. Yeah,
I got it on sale for 10.
yeah.
So they will do sales on IAPs too.
So I was part of what I was getting at was like a cost thing, right? Like I don't know. I actually don't know why this is, but like there are a bunch of companies that have iOS versions of their apps for like $5 and VSTs for like $80, and I don't know why that happens.
So
But it does present some opportunities to be frugal in the app world. Um,
yeah,
do you
I
know why
think
that is?
the answer that I see for that is developers. It's kind of twofold. One is probably the way that Apple treats their app store. So
Mhm.
Apple, they love the walled garden approach. You buy into the ecosystem, you love it, or you don't really care about it and you want to shout how bad Apple is. I don't really care. But they have a walled garden approach for their app store, so they highly regulate, apps, and they get, I think it's like 20 to 30%
Yeah.
of app sales. But also another thing is the like we were saying before, like even though it may seem like this, really big thing, like the majority of people with iPads aren't using them for music.
Right.
And even smaller number of people with iPhones are using them for music. It's probably like less than 1% or some, maybe I'm hyperbole, but the market is so much smaller, so developers charge much less, so that way people feel like they're getting a better deal for
Mhm.
the apps. And because they're on that wall garden, they can't bring it outside of that system until you get to the universal app, which is what some people are doing, like Moog is doing with Model D and Model 15 and
Right.
that kind of stuff. So that's one aspect. Yeah, and if I see something like a really good example is FabFilter.
Hmm.
You can get the FabFilter suite on sale for $90 on iOS,
Hmm.
and it costs like $500 or whatever,
Yeah.
$400 on desktop. And like, yeah, you lose some flexibility in how you use it potentially. There's a different interface that's not, you know, maybe tied to your primary music producing device, but it's the same exact software, just
Yeah.
in a smaller package.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing that I, the other thing that I point out is like, I use VSTs between multiple computers, and most of them allow licensing for several
Right.
computers at once. I That's also true with iOS devices. I have some apps on my phone that I also have on my iPad that I also have on my uh, I, uh,
MacBook.
Airbook MacBook.
Yeah.
Um, but but like I do like switch back and forth between computers for stuff, and it's nice to be able to have you know my VSTs and Bitwig set
Right.
up
Yeah.
in multiple places
Yeah.
at once.
Yeah. I think another factor I was thinking of, the fact that everything is relatively cheap. Like, I think the most that I sent on an app was probably AUM. I think AUM is $20, and it
I think 25 maybe. I think I was trying to think of the most expensive thing I bought, and that was AUM as well. And I think it was 25. It might have been 20.
right. But like, I mean that software is invaluable. You might as well, right? But like most things are $5, $10.
Right.
Like I got some apps that I use daily for like $1
Yeah.
or free even. Like it's kind of wild just thinking about like that stuff. And there is that sort of, I'll call it an itis. Like you buy a MIDI controller, you get a bunch of free, usually light versions of the software for your desktop. You get Ableton Live or whatever. And like, yeah, you'll use that for a while, but eventually you're gonna want a little bit better stuff and stuff you might be more
Hmm.
invested in. So like, there's that sort of like thing is, if I bought it, I might as well use it.
Right.
So like, there are certain things that I got for free. Like, one example is, I don't think I've talked about this on the Zoya server, but there's a developer called FAC, Fred Anton Corvest. I think he's French. He makes probably the best effects on iOS, and like they're priced decently well, but like I had free versions of them, so I didn't end up getting them. But he did a rare sale like a couple months ago, so I bought all of them, and like I use them all the time because they're really really good apps.
Yeah.
And because I paid for them, I feel like that I should be using them more than I use the free ones. So it's kind of a weird concept that way too.
Yeah. I I can appreciate that. Yeah.
But yeah, but he's got like a transient shaper. He's got like weird things that you wouldn't like think about. He's got like, I don't know. It's just really cool stuff. Um, let's see what else. All right, I think we're gonna move into the sort of final thing that I had planned, and then we could just talk about whatever. So I did the whole external in, external out, or external in, iPad out. Now I want to talk about like groove boxes, sort of,
Yep.
and sequencing. So there is no shortage of that sort of stuff on iOS. The biggest one, in my opinion, is Drambo. Drambo does everything because Drambo is Drambo. Basically, it's kind of like if Electron made a sequencer that you can visualize rather than
Hmm.
sort of guess where things are. It does have a bit of quirks. It also has a modular synth engine because why not?
Right.
And also a very powerful sequencer. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit, and then I'll talk about some other generative stuff because people love generative sequencing, which is really, really cool.
You're talking to the generative guy, you know?
Absolutely. All right, so this this one. No, I wanted the other one. Hold on. I labeled them and I obviously labeled them the wrong order. All right, so what I'm using here, I'm using an app called Drumkit, which is a drum kit. It's a sample-based drum kit that also offers a single-site waveform. So basically, you can combine and layer sounds how you want. Plus, it has envelopes and that kind of stuff. And then I'm using
I like the envelopes. I've looked at that one before. I'm an envelope snob, so.
Yeah. And then I'm using a sequencer that's sort of like a Euclidean sequencer for the drums. And then I've got two generative sequencers for two pianos that sort of riff off each other. And I'm using a sampled piano. I'm using a piano that I got, I think for free. Some person was giving away like a free sampled piano pack, and I grabbed it because why not? And they're actually really, really good. So we'll go through that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with it just playing by itself, and then I'll start connecting additional connections so you can play my modular or Hydra. So it's sort of like a interplay between things.
So are you using AUM to route the MIDI to different places? Is that what I was seeing? Your mic's down, I think.
Hello?
Yeah,
Is that better?
you got a synth going on still somewhere. I think it's the modular.
Good?
Yep.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there was just a connection that was still. Thank you. Yes. So AUM is handling the extra MIDI routings.
Hmm.
So like I said before, there's some normal ones that I always want there, and then there's the extra ones that I can bring in on the fly.
Yeah.
So for instance, there's two sequencers. There's it's sort of a game of life sequencer.
Hmm.
Is doing the primary piano. It's basically just playing a C major scale. And then there's they call it a wormhole sequencer.
Okay.
So basically, you can go through sequences, and then at defined steps, you can say you're on step 3, you can go to 17 or back to 5.
Okay.
It's sort of Cartesian, but not specifically on that scale.
Sure.
So basically, those two are defining the two pianos. So you have like a higher tone, like a more consistent one, and then one that's playing root notes and stuff like that. So I had those playing along with the drums, and then I would bring in and out the piano in favor of either the modular on a lower octave or a Hydra patch. Basically, just to like mix up the sound sourcing using the same melody.
Yeah.
So it feels very modular because you're making connections and you're changing routings. Like I was messing with the levels and messing with like the patch that I was using. So it's very sort of like hands-on in that way, even though everything's sort of like playing for you. Like I didn't have to press a single key when I was making that, which was very interesting. As far as the drums go, it's like a default bank that the app provided that I tweaked slightly. I added like a chorus to it just to give it some weird, effect. But yeah, one thing I do want to point about that, but beyond the sort of the flexible MIDI routing is the pianos on their own are very, very quiet.
Okay.
The samples that I had for some reason, so they're multi-sampled and they're like different velocity layers.
Hmm.
But for some reason, the way that it was set up is like to get to like the loudest level, you have to like basically hit it full bore, like slam down on the keys.
Yeah.
So normally it'd be very, very low. So that's where the FAC sort of like, I call them, what would I call them? I call them like boring apps because it's like
Dynamics processors,
dynamic
right?
stuff. It's like a compressor, like a max, like a limiter, a transient shaper, that kind of stuff that like you wouldn't normally think of.
Yeah.
And like I had a reverb and a phaser just for whatever, for effects. So like that sort of stuff is really nice to have on the platform because it makes it more of a legitimate producing tool.
Sure.
Like if you hand a producer an iPad and it didn't have a good compressor, they'd be like, this is useless to me.
Yeah.
Like, I would never use this. So like the fact that it has that sort of like utilitarian stuff in addition to the really, really fun and innovative stuff is hugely beneficial.
Yeah. And I could see, like, I was thinking back to the intro that you did. Like, there's some places where I might want to do some compression and some EQing on that signal just to get it a little, because thing about pitch shifting is that the high notes may be technically as loud as the low notes, but you'll hear them more,
Right.
clearly. So, like that stuff is pretty important once you get beyond once you get to the shaping of the sound.
Right. Once you get sort of beyond the fun, I don't want to call it fun because everything's fun, but like
Yeah.
the like the shiny stuff.
Right.
Like once you get beyond the granulars, it's like, all right, how do I actually want to like shape this into a sound or a song or something. And a lot of what I'm seeing more recently, and this is a trend on desktop too, is more multi-band stuff and more like transient versus tonal
Yeah.
separation. So there's apps that provide that as well.
I just updated Bitwig today, finally, to get my spectral suite that I stomped my foot about. I didn't do much of the public stomping of the feet, but I did support
You
it.
did stomp a
So
couple times.
yeah,
Yeah, it was worth
I
it.
didn't get it out of the Zoya server, which I didn't. There were places where there's a lot more eyeballs. I'm sorry to say this. Any viewers who from the Zoya server, it's a small pond inside a small pond inside a small pond compared to like the KVR.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a thread on it in Audiobus as well. They were very much not happy.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, this is potentially a tangent, but I think because it feels like a bigger community than it is, people get really, really passionate about it.
Yeah. Well, I think, the other part of it, at least with Bitwig, is that like that community always saw itself as sort of, and you see this even in the dialogue that developed out of that, saw itself as like supporting an underdog,
Yep.
which, okay, yeah, like I'm sure it doesn't have as many users as like FL Studio and Ableton and that sort of thing, but like Bitwig isn't like two dudes in a garage, like
Right.
just like trying to make it work. Like at this point, it's a real legitimate company that like should probably have decent PR, and I'm hoping they at the very least like learned a lot about interacting with that community
Yeah.
from this, because that was handled poorly, let's say.
Yeah. 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 I have. I'm not going to name names, but I have seen some folks in the Audiobus forums being potentially more entitled than they should be about certain things. But I've also seen devs that feel the same way about their users.
Yeah.
So I mean, it depends on the person to person, but you see that in any sort of small niche company. But for the most part, you know, the devs are the same people that are using the software. Like they're gonna want it to be as cool and as cutting edge as we want it to be. So I think you're kind of shouting at the wrong person.
Yeah.
In some aspects. But yeah, there was one more music thing I wanted to show off. Because I said it many times. I'm finally going to talk about Drambo. Let's show off Drambo.
Yeah.
In potentially a less shiny way than it deserves. But again, I'm using a drum synth. I'm using this. This did actually come out of the Audiobus forum. Someone, DJ Puzzle, sampled a old Gretsch like acoustic drums
Kit. Yeah.
and I see a lot of people lamenting that there's not really a good amount of acoustic instruments, let alone drums, on this platform. So the fact that there are sample packs, and I think there are a few apps that offer acoustic drum samples or acoustic drums that are made,
Right.
So I think that's some aspect that could use a little bit more of a push, because I know I would I use this kit all the time. It's something that I would love to see, because electronic drums are cool, but you kind of miss that band feel.
Well, especially like the other part of it is, you can do some really interesting stuff with layering, synth drums and acoustic samples.
Right. Yeah, and that's what Drumkit offers. So yeah, it's it's a 16 piece kit with some extra like oscillators just to sort of beef it up and extend it. So I'm using Drambo for the sequencing, and then I've got a sort of a pad like sound. So initially, I had a this multi-band lo-fi effect on it. So I'm just gonna show it off without that. I mean, they sound pretty good to me. I'm not an expert on acoustic drums, but. And then you can muck them up.
Nice.
Excuse me. Lots of switching things. I mean, it works.
I can you hear me? I don't know
Yes.
if you can. Yeah. Okay. So one thing I was thinking about, and I was wondering if this might be a limitation of the iPad approach. I was listening to that and I was thinking like it'd be kind of cool if you took different drums from the sequence, and I think at one point you had like three different synth voices going
Yep.
on, like, and took different drums from the. I have a cat who wants attention. If you took three different drum outputs and sidechained each of the synth voices on different hits, right? Like, so one sidechained by the kick, one sidechained by the snare, one sidechained by the tom, or something like that. But then I thought, I don't know if you can, like, whether you have access to those sorts of outputs in the like in the app to take that
Right.
through AUM to a side chain, like if there's a limitation there in terms of connectivity.
That is a great question. The answer is yes, you can do that.
Oh,
And it's an AUM thing. They call it a. Let me get the phrase right. It's called a multi-bus audio unit instance.
okay,
Basically, it's just different ins and outs.
right.
So, for instance, Drumkit offers a main output. Actually, let me just confirm that in the application. So I can load up Drumkit. If I open up a new channel, basically the way that this works is everything's channel based.
Right.
So I have the main audio unit, and this is where AUV3 really, really shines.
Hmm.
So AUV3 is just it's a plugin platform for Mac and iOS. Um, it's similar to VST and all the other ones, but the cool thing is you can have different instances within the same session, as
Hmm.
opposed to one instance in one instrument, which is called inter-app audio.
Right.
So
Okay.
the old standard was inter-app audio. So that means you can have one instance of each app playing, and they would be on different screens that you have to shuffle between.
Right.
Then Audio Bus came out, which was an audio mixer that allowed you to have multiple apps on one screen that you can switch to change the settings
Yeah.
on each of those apps. Then came the audio units, which is basically a way to see multiple synths, change their parameters, and have multiple instances of that plugin all within the same window.
Hmm.
So if I load up an instance of Drumkit and then I go to multi-bus, I see 0 in, 17 outputs.
Okay.
So that means
Yeah.
I can take each of those kits plus the main out and separate it from the main output and use
Yeah.
it for sidechaining.
Yeah. Or processing
Or
separate,
processing with different effects
yeah.
or whatever.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's one of the really, really cool things about it. So the MIDI I was using for the synth voice was that MIDI tape recorder,
Okay.
which is a free app made by that Moog. I forget his name. I apologize.
Yeah.
But people know him. Like he's a known name. And basically, it has 4 inputs and 4 outputs. So if you had a setup where you had 4 different MIDI channels or 4 different controllers, you can record them all at the same time and then send them to different synths and have it recorded, all in sync with all the MIDI information, all that stuff. So that could be a really powerful way to sequence without a sequencer.
Yeah.
But for that case, I had recorded them separately in different takes and then just muted which ones I didn't want going to the synth.
Nice.
Yep.
I definitely am leaving this with a lot of ideas,
Well,
and a lot of things cleared up too.
that's good. I'm glad that's been helpful, and I hope people walk away with at least an understanding of like maybe what to expect initially. Like as I mentioned, initially it was a little bit of a struggle. Like as with any sort of new sort of system, it's easy to add more pedals and add more physical synths. But when you get into something that's like it's a synth, but it's also a controller, it's also a recorder, and it's a bunch of different things.
Yeah.
It's a little intimidating, but if you sort of narrow it down to the different use cases, like as its own sort of standalone thing, which I still think is an amazing use for it, as a processor for external effects, as a sequencer, as a synth generator, the list goes on.
And you can watch Netflix on it.
Yes, you can.
I'm just, like that's the other part of it, right? Like particularly when you're talking about the portability, right? It's this thing that like you can also, use it for work and other stuff too, right? Like, I can't do that with my Zoya. I've tried it,
Yeah. If you asked me in the past, I mean, I didn't really like going on planes for me when I was younger. I'd bring my Game Boy. That was the thing that I had with me.
Yeah.
I wasn't a music maker. I would play guitar. I can't really bring a guitar on a plane. But like now, whenever I fly, I bring the iPad because I can make music. I can watch shows. I can do a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely worth it. I think in particular, one thing that I didn't mention earlier, sort of in the device choosing phase, something that I would avoid potentially is specifically the airs.
Okay.
Not because they're not powerful enough, but they're definitely less powerful than a Pro and even more even strangely than like the older ones that are specifically had a headphone jack or could only run older OS. So
Right.
even the Air is in this weird sort of like it's probably the one that I would use for music the least.
Right.
If I had to pick one, like the Mini probably would be fine for running like standalone stuff.
Yeah. That's how I see people use I've seen that particular use
Right.
case a fair amount.
But
Like
like
I have a Mini that I just use for this thing.
right, exactly, and that's totally legit. But for some reason, like Sam has an Air, and it works fine. But it's pretty it gets pretty slow even running the basic stuff,
Yeah.
which I found very surprising. Like I'm scrolling through it, I'm like, why is it taking me forever to close this app or whatever?
I feel like the Air was designed to like capital once like they had the iPad out there and they saw that a bunch of people were using them to watch Netflix, right?
Play games or whatever.
And they have like the bigger screen and like that's so like it makes sense for like those sort of single use. They usually have pretty good displays.
Yeah.
So
It looks nice.
yeah.
It's great for Procreate.
Yeah.
But just maybe not for like playing music on it. Like if you're, especially with the M2s, like I would go Pro all the way.
Price is hard to beat. I mean,
That's true.
so well, if you're going to make that sort of expenditure, the price for the Pro 2 or the M2 Pros looks pretty darn good. So, and I have an M1. I'm using an I'm pointing at the computer that I'm talking to you through. This is an M1, and like again, the specs are sort of spec'd for like people who do video production. My M1s can do everything without breaking a sweat. So and this is not my computer is the MacBook Air M1, but like I don't do a ton of like 84 different instances of like high CPU VSTs running all at the same time, but like for what I do, it's a really powerful chipset. Let's just say.
Yeah,
So,
I don't want to say impatiently because my Intel Mac is still going strong, but I'm looking forward to being able to go M1
yeah,
M2 for whatever they do for the MacBooks. Just because it's starting to get to the point where I can't like I'm still on Catalina, like I can't run a ton of stuff within Logic. Like mixing, mastering, totally fine. Like
right.
everything's already there. But like if I'm
Yeah.
playing a synth and doing a bunch of effects, I have to maybe watch out for poly count sometimes,
Yeah.
especially on the augmented arcade.
Yeah. I'm having like I'm trying to figure out like what the Black Friday situation for Arturia is going to be and whether I should snag the piano one at the introductory price or wait and see what sort of bundle I can get in a couple of weeks. And they've set it up in such a way that I've got to make that decision before the sales are announced, probably.
Yeah, I saw an offer for because I have 8 plus SQ and then the strings intro, but I saw an offer for the augmented trio for 100.
I saw that too, and I saw a piano for 49, 50. So like that's sort of the question is like that's not bad. That's pretty good price. Will there be? Because I kind of want to, and I assume piano won't be added to V Collection 9. It'll be in V Collection 10. So then, and I'm sure 10 will wait until they have a couple more synths. So, it's that game. You know that game.
Yeah, I think I'm firmly in the waiting for 10 camp because
mm,
I suspect that Mini Freak will be available by that point, standalone,
right, right.
um, along with the piano, and hopefully they add like a drum synth.
That'd be cool. They're sort of running like I've seen some people theorizing that the next thing they do. I don't know where this is from. Whether it's like there was some like vague reference or what it was a synthex, an
Oh yeah.
Elka synthex.
Well,
But like
Cherry just made one, right?
maybe I there's so many people doing like that's the other side of this, right? Is like there are so many apps and so many VSTs and it's sort of like I I saw that Cherry put out a couple things in the past couple months, and I was like, I don't know. There's one with sine waves. I know what those do. I read about that one. But like yeah, some people were speculating that the announcement earlier this week would be that they were reviving the Spark, um, which I have an old version of because I got I don't think they include it in V Collection anymore. But that was a weird controller app,
It's on
uh,
iOS too.
yeah, yeah, and it was a great little drum synth that just didn't take off for whatever reason.
Right.
Um, but yeah, they're sort of running out of stuff. I mean,
Yeah.
in terms of like mining the past for just polyphonic, monophonic synths.
I mean, it was pretty apparent with 9. I mean, there was only, I mean, maybe I'm selling it short, but like there was only really one new one because they already had SQ out for a while.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds really good, the MS-20,
Well,
but
and then they're putting the Augmentic series in those because you sort of get the impression like we've got to have something in there,
right,
and
right, right.
and the Augmented series is really cool. I, as you know, I'm partial to pianos, so that one in particular.
If my computer could reasonably run it, I would probably hop on the deal, but not now.
Yeah, yeah. Um,
So,
so
but yeah, we'll see.
we're in the sort of like riffing period now. We didn't announce that, I don't think, but we're there, right?
We're very much in the riffing
Yeah,
period, which is fine because I'm that was all the sound ideas that I had. Let me just double check. Intro to Borderlands, effects demo, synth demo, groovebox sequence. Yeah, that was it. Then I
yeah,
put wrap up, closing thoughts.
yeah. So we're in the wrap up closing thoughts, which is just sort of Mike and I talking to each other. Usually, I mean, that's usually what it is.
I mean, that's fine.
Yeah.
I'm cool with that.
No, but I do think this was pretty illuminating.
I'm glad. I'm happy to help, especially because I know I was trying to push you into using the iPad more, and then it just wasn't really. Maybe it's
There's
base,
like the other part is the other big hurdle is just like tablets in general don't. I need to use it more. Like that's the big thing, right? Is because I don't have a background using tablets. They feel weird. Like there's a weird like I don't know. Am I supposed to hold it? Am I supposed? Are you getting that? Doubt. I don't know if you can hear me.